You must love podcasts if you're listening to this. Do you want to start your own one or you already have one? Then follow Smarter Podcasting to get expert advice from me, Neil Mackay, the podcast guy. Since 2019, we've worked with over 40 podcasters, produced over 700 episodes, and helped many podcasts get to the top of the Apple Podcast charts. And right now, I'm offering you a professional edit for just $27. Click the link in the show notes. Hey, it's Neil Mackay, the podcast guy, with a special episode of Smarter Podcasting. During the pandemic, I launched the 7 Million Bikes website with the help of a developer friend who set it up for me, created an account on Elementor for me to build it, and set me free. Luckily, being stuck at home meant that I had a lot of time to work on it. I had to learn so much in a short space of time, and one of the most important things I had to learn about was SEO and domain authority for my website. I started to write blogs at the same time about lots of different things, about 30 different pub quiz team names, the best places to get alcohol and food delivered during the lockdown, why I became a comedian, and what does the name 7 Million Bikes mean? And I can tell you that another time. At the time, the 7 Million Bikes brand encompassed podcasts, comedy, and events. I had started running a podcast first, then I started doing comedy, started running my own shows, and then started running events like quiz nights and even music gigs before the pandemic. Now, as you can imagine, building a business based on live events during a pandemic was pretty challenging. I was getting lots of praise for how much I was doing, and on the face of it, it seemed like things were going well. But in reality, while I was doing well at lots of things, I was being successful in none of them. And by success, I mean making enough money to earn a living. I was busy, but none of it was really building anything sustainable. Then a young marketing graduate posted on Facebook that she wanted to write blogs for her portfolio and experience. As soon as I talked to her, I was instantly impressed by her energy, her enthusiasm, and most of all, her knowledge. She knew way more than me about SEO, domain authority, writing blogs, keyword research, all the stuff I needed for my website. I remember when we were eventually let out of the house, we met for coffee and she tried to explain to me that I should focus on just one thing. If I wanted to build my domain authority and SEO, I couldn't write blog posts about lots of different things. That's not how Google works. But I didn't really listen. I'd been through a workshop with a business consultant, and I decided with him that the 7 Million Bikes brand was an entertainment brand. Podcasts, comedy, and events. These were all entertainment and they could all be promoted that way. By the end of the pandemic, I realized I couldn't build a business based on events. Not when they can be taken away from you at a moment's notice. So I reluctantly decided I needed to focus on just one thing. The thing that I loved doing the most and that had changed my life, podcasts. During this time, I also redesigned my website to focus on that one thing, podcasting. I removed all blog posts about comedy or quiz nights, removed the event calendar, and anything not related to podcasts. I finally understood what Anii had been trying to explain to me. For a website to rank on Google, it needs to focus on just one thing, and it's going to be podcasts. Go look at my website now, 7millionbikes.com, and that's what you'll see. It's completely different to how it was when it started. And since I made that decision to focus only on podcasts, my business grew instantly. To the point where I now work with podcasters across the world to help them build their audience and connect with their community. And I can earn a full-time living from my hobby. And hire other people to help me do that. As part of this rebranding, I changed from just 7 Million Bikes that did everything to just 7 Million Bikes Podcasts. I put my long-standing show that launched my podcasting career on a long hiatus, even though the downloads were bigger than ever. And I started this podcast, Smarter Podcasting, to help share what I've learned with you. And one of the things that I have learned over the years is the importance of putting out content, even if it's not technically yours. Which brings me back to that marketing graduate who started writing blog posts for me, Anii Hoang. We've stayed in close contact over the years and it has been amazing watching her growth. Anii has now created her own podcast and YouTube channel called the Aspiring CMO, which stands for Chief Marketing Officer. If you're like me and didn't know what that meant, I had to ask her. She now shares digital marketing and entrepreneurship insights from real results, stories, and people. And I can't tell you how impressed I am with her content. And Anii invited me to be a guest on her show. Now, this last week, I've been on vacation with some friends and my wife to celebrate her 40th birthday. I shut off my phone and my computer and didn't do any work. But that also meant I didn't have an episode for this week. Now, I recommend to anyone to have at least 3 episodes recorded ahead of time for situations just like this. But I'm just not wired that way. I like to do things last minute. Shh, don't tell anyone. So I asked Anii if I could share my interview with her on the Aspiring CMO with you. And she said yes. Thanks, Anii. Not only though is this a win for me, this is also great exposure for her show to a new audience. Whether you're desperate for a new episode or not like me, this is a great strategy to maximize the exposure of being interviewed on other podcasts. While I wouldn't make it a condition of being interviewed on another podcast, I recommend for any interview that you do, ask afterwards if you can share that episode on your channel, but give full credit to them with links back to their show. So with full credit to Anii Hoang from the Aspiring CMO, here's my interview with her about how to run a podcast to get more customers and clients. Enjoy. So it's all about brand leadership and like thought leadership. So just even by having a podcast, you're putting yourself out there as somebody who knows what they're talking about. And if I don't know what you exactly want to do with your personal brand or what you want to promote, but that puts you in a position of authority and leadership immediately.
In today's episode, I'm going to sit down and talk to Neil Mackay, the podcast guy. And he is now helping his clients to start their podcast and become thought leaders in their industry.
Right now, you'd be silly not to have a podcast as a business. It's just one of the best ways to market.
In this episode, we're going to dive into Neil's case studies on how podcasting really helped businesses to grow and get more clients and leads. If you ever thought about creating a podcast, this is probably the time for it. But if you're still hesitant, do listen to Neil's episode and stay tuned. Welcome, Neil, to the Aspiring CMO podcast. Amazing to have you here. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me on.
I'm really happy for your business. I started working with, we were working together exactly a year ago, right? And I think I saw the inception of your podcasting course, and I'm super, super happy with the smarter podcasting, your community, and I see so many clients you got now. So yeah, congrats.
Yeah, no, it's exciting that you were there and you gave me such great advice. And I will tell you what advice that you gave me, which I didn't take at the time because I was still figuring out what I was actually doing. But later on, once I took that advice, I was like, oh, I get exactly what she was talking about. But I also have you to blame.
Great.
Because when I first decided to do a podcast course, it was one of these ones where I warned people not to do this and I fell for it, where you read a blog or you read something and it's like, oh, start a side hustle, make some extra money, start a YouTube channel, a podcast, a blog, or an online course. And I was like, oh, I could do an online course. That'll be easy. I'll take some of the blog posts that Anii had created and I'll put it into a course on Teachable and then I'll sell that and I'll make some side income. And then I showed it to you, and then you recommended me to talk to Mike. And by the time I showed it to both of you, you were both like, this is worthless and garbage, basically, because it was basically just text on a screen, which I now realize. So between you and Mike, you were like, you got to go make videos, slides, PDFs, quizzes, all of this. So then I can sometimes not get obsessive, but I was like, okay, this is what I'm doing. I'm all in on this. And so for about 9 months, 8 months, every spare moment that I had, I was in my spare bedroom, writing scripts, recording them, editing them. It took so long to create that course, and totally worth it because now it is valuable. What I was planning in the beginning, just to take some blogs and put them and charge people for it, was a terrible idea. So, but I have you to blame for that because I was just it was going to take me like a week to do that. And instead it took me 9 months of hard work.
I mean, 9 months is still not that long, really. Some people spend years and years building their online courses. So Yeah, again, another congratulations. It's only 9 months. So yeah, but let's just start with like, how did you start podcasting? Because, a lot of people might want to know your starting story.
It was just boredom. So what happened was, I've always been a massive podcast fan since like way back, like before you were born, which makes me feel really old. I was like in the
Wait,
early
they had
2000s.
podcasting before 98?
You were born in 98. I started listening to podcasting in like 2000s. So nearly.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. It was the first ever podcast was published 20 years ago. Just this week was the anniversary of the first ever podcast.
Wow.
Yeah. So I was listening to the Ricky Gervais show, then obviously get into Serial. Have you ever heard Serial, the story of the Adnan Syed story? It was like the first major true crime podcast.
Yes,
It was like
yes,
a
yes.
global phenomenon. And that was really exciting. Like my wife and I think the first and only time I've ever listened to a podcast with someone else, because it was week by week and it was like true crime. You're like, what's going to happen? And so we'd lie on the couch and like listen to it on the speakers, which it's pretty unusual because podcasting is a very solo thing to do. But we listened to that, and then you'd go meet up with friends. Like, did you listen to the latest episode? So that was really the rebirth of the podcasting as a global phenomenon. Was the Serial podcast. And then from there, I just always been a podcast listener. And so my wife and I, we spend a lot of time together. We're kind of an unusual company that we really like spending time with each other and spend all our free time together. And so our schedules changed, and she now had to work on a Sunday and I had a Sunday off. And so I was just starting to get really bored because, didn't have a huge amount of friends here. And the number one thing to do would be go out drinking, right, on a Sunday. And I didn't really want to go out drinking all day without her, because then by the time she'd finish work, I'd probably be wasted. And that's no fun for anyone if your partner's already wasted from Sunday drinking, even though that is a fun thing to do. But so I was pretty bored. And then I was like, I should start a podcast. That'd be cool. Also because living in Saigon, there's so many interesting people here. And being an English teacher at the time, one of the things you hear time and time again is, oh, what do you do? Oh, I'm just an English teacher. And they kind of say it in this negative connotation. And I realized slowly that none of these people were just an English teacher. They'd all had super interesting backgrounds, whether they were musicians or leather workers or artists or anything. Like, they had such interesting backgrounds. So that was really the impetus, was to share those stories, to get behind just a teacher. So that's kind of where it started to share stories of people living in Saigon. So originally it was called 7 Million Bikes, a Saigon podcast, which is a way too long a name and breaks all the rules of podcasting names. But that was the original name. And then it I didn't even realize at the time how much it took off almost instantly. Now starting other podcasts since then, and you're like, oh, wow, okay, that did really well. And then it grew. I can't even remember what the exact point was, but started to interview people outside of Vietnam. But it was always somebody connected to Vietnam. So whether they were Hungarian Vietnamese or Swiss Vietnamese, American Vietnamese, they all had a story to share about Vietnam and a connection to Vietnam. And so then that just kind of grew from there. And then I started a second podcast because I'm also a stand-up comedian called Did That Really Happen? And that was just like something I just loved. Every time I heard a comedian, I always thought, even before I started doing comedy, I'd be like, wow, did that really happen? Because it's just hear the craziest stories. And then as I started doing comedy and telling those crazy stories, and I'm like, that actually did really happen. And every time I asked a comedian, they were like, oh no, I couldn't make that up. That was 100% true. So that whole premise of that podcast was interviewing a comedian, playing one of their jokes, then asking them, did that really happen? And then they explain the joke, and we talk about comedy. So that was my initial foray into creating my own podcasts.
Amazing. I love the start of the Vietnam podcast. Now you call the Vietnam podcast, right?
Yeah, and then as I started to interview more people outside of Saigon, it changed to a Vietnam podcast, and I dropped the 7 Million Bikes, and that became more of the brand for the entire company.
Awesome. What's that? And what was the milestone for the Vietnam podcast? Because I think you shared it on your social. Was it 10K downloads?
50,000 downloads we hit recently.
Yeah,
which was a major milestone.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's not like it's always hard comparing yourself. Some podcasters do hundreds of thousands, millions of downloads, but it doesn't really matter. Like, it's not insignificant. And as well, starting your own podcast, like the feeling of having 50,000 downloads. And then when you look at like the hours listened, I can't even remember the last time I looked. It's, hundreds, if not thousands of hours listened. I guess it would be thousands, tens of thousands of hours listened. And you're like, wow, somebody listened to this that much, which is crazy.
It is. I mean, I just crossed the 10 episode milestone for myself, and I was like, wow, that's like, it was a lot. It's a lot of work to do a podcast, and you do 2. How do you actually? No, you do 3, right? You have the smarter podcast.
Well, technically I do about 20 is the
by yourself.
But by myself. But well, no, not by myself. So a Vietnam podcast went up to season 9. And then, as you know, you were a guest host on it. And part of that was because I was starting to lose a bit of my passion for it. I felt like I wasn't giving it my full effort because I was so busy with other projects. And I felt like I was getting repetitive in some of the episodes and the questions. And so I opened it up to guest hosts. So that's where you came in. You did a guest hosting, which was amazing. It's cool because 3 people who did a guest host spot on a Vietnam podcast went on to start their own podcast. So you, Mika Chu, and Misha Smith all now started their own podcast after doing that. So that's like pretty crazy. Yeah. And I love when you have that influence on people you didn't even mean to do or realize. So that was pretty cool. So a Vietnam podcast was going, and then the comedy one was going, but that was more of a side project, the comedy one. I was not following any of the rules of podcasting. I wasn't being consistent. I wasn't promoting it. I wasn't really doing much with it at all. It was just more. Another thing as well, as I was working on more and more podcasts, I wanted to try new tools because on a Vietnam podcast, I'd only ever used Buzzsprout. I'd only ever used, GarageBand and then Descript. And so I wanted to try and use different tools and techniques. So I started to use Anchor, which is now Spotify for podcasts, as the host. And I can't remember, a couple of other things I changed. And I was also trying to see how quickly I could do it because a Vietnam podcast, podcasts take a long time. So I was like, how quickly can I make a podcast? Because for a 1-hour episode, I've worked it out before. In total, by the time you make the social media assets, you post them, you share them, you edit it, you come up with the questions, you interview the guest, it's probably about 8 hours of work for an hour of 100%. A podcast interview. Yeah, so you see that as well.
Right now, yeah. We're just going to take a quick break to mention that you can also sign up for Niels' podcasting course in the show notes below. Neil has spent all of his experience and energy into diving in how to really start your podcast, from hosting, the microphone equipment, and choosing your podcast name, all these little nuances that beginner podcasters or just marketers in general get caught on. He will dive into all the shortcuts that you need to know to effectively start your podcast and get into the interviewing session and confidently show yourself for your future customers and future leads.
It's crazy. Nobody realizes that in the beginning, right? And so that was the second one. So Vietnam podcast, eventually I sadly put it on a break, which took I wanted to do it for a long time. And I didn't do it because, one, I had a really good community on Patreon who were giving a donation to the podcast, but it's not enough to pay the bills or really pay much at all. But it's more the gesture that they're actually giving something to the podcast. So that was part of why I didn't stop it. One of my listeners, who you probably know, Zion, he has a tattoo of my logo on him. He got a tattoo.
I know,
which is just mind blowing that somebody got a tattoo. And I've read he's written a blog about why he loved 7 Million Bikes, why he loved the Vietnam podcast, because it helped him settle into the city. And I've met people who have come to Vietnam. They're like, oh, hey, I listened to your podcast before I got here and things like that. So it was really difficult to stop it because it was so well loved. Sadly, eventually I put a Vietnam podcast on a long hiatus. But what I did in the meantime to keep it going, because I could see there was still a demand for it, was I would do 2 things. I would do something called a podcast, which I would post an old episode, and it would get more downloads than a regular episode. So I would do a new introduction for it and explain why I'm posting it, because I built up such a big back catalogue of old episodes. from years in the past and starting to understand people's podcasting habits. You know, when you come across a new podcast, you're often going to just look at the newest episode. You might not go all the way back 2 years because it's a long way to scroll down. So I would take these old episodes, and then often as well, when I initially recorded them, it was on a Blue Yeti mic in a big room. The sound wasn't great. And so I would remaster them like a Star Wars movie. I would digitally remaster them, which means I would put them through like Descript, turn on the studio sound, and increase the quality of the audio. So that was pretty cool to be able to post an old episode but increase the quality of it. So I was doing podcasts, and then I was doing pod swaps. So I would take podcasts from either one that I had been interviewed on, as long as it was connected to Vietnam. That was the biggest thing. If I was on another podcast, it had to be about a Vietnam podcast, basically. And with the permission of that person, I would then post that on a Vietnam podcast, do an intro for it, like, hey, this is me on XYZ podcast, check it out. Or then I started to make podcasts for other people here in Vietnam. And again, with their permission, I would post their episodes on my channel. So I was able to consistently post content, but it was never consistent. And it was never brand new content. But just the fact of being able to keep pushing out content on that channel. Again, it probably breaks all the rules of podcasting. I've never really seen anybody else do that before or do it so consistently. But I was staying true to my niche, which my niche is connection to Vietnam. So I wasn't just posting any random podcast on there. It was always something that featured me or a client I worked with that was about Vietnam. And then, so that's now been 9 months. And then the crazy thing was, I went back and looked at my downloads after not checking them for ages, and they were going up and up and up, higher than they'd ever been before without any new content.
Wow.
And I was like blown away. So I was still posting content sometimes, but not new content. So like, say, for example, a pod swap, so another podcast. So I looked at the stats a little bit, and I was like, where are all these downloads coming from? Because like the episode I would post would get about the same as what an episode normally got, but I was getting all these downloads. So then I looked into it. So about 80% of my downloads were coming from my back catalog. Okay. So that was like unbelievably exciting to be like, because I designed the podcast from the beginning to be evergreen, so that we never really discussed current events. So I never was like, hey, come to my comedy show this weekend. We never really talked about what was happening in the news. We tried to talk about people's stories, which obviously never change. And even during COVID and during the lockdown, I tried my very best to avoid all talk about that. It came up a little bit because it was so difficult to not talk about it at the time. But I wanted to make sure it wasn't the focus of the episode. And so the point of that is, if you go back and listen to an episode of a Vietnam podcast from 2 years ago, you shouldn't really be able to tell whether it was recorded last week or last year, because the content is evergreen.
That's a really great tip, to repurpose content. Like people always think of repurposing content, like taking the current one and then making it into like different social channels, whereas you actually kept the same channel, but you just used the old content to put it into a newer version, which is pretty amazing. Yeah. Do you use the same thing for your clients?
Well, so now it's not using old episodes yet because most of them are pretty new, but definitely repurposing content. So what I advise now is, your podcast is just one asset, and then you want to use that asset for various different channels and social media. So if you do video is maybe the main asset. So you're going to take the video, then you're going to take the audio, you're going to put that on a podcast, then you're going to break the video down into short form content for Reels and TikTok and YouTube Shorts and Instagram. And then you're also going to want to create a blog post for that episode so that the episode has somewhere to live on your website. So yeah.
What are some of the key rules of podcasting? Because you did mention it a lot ever since we started this episode, but like, could you just like list down some of the rules that you go by and advise your clients?
I wanted to share with you about one of my favorite affiliate partners, and that is Fiverr. I've been using Fiverr for years for everything from ordering YouTube thumbnails to keyword research, writing podcast articles, even to Canva designs and thumbnails and more. So whether you're a budding entrepreneur, a podcaster, or anyone in between, Fiverr has got you covered. It really is the go-to platform if you want to find freelancers offering a massive range of services to help you on any project. Maybe you need a stunning new logo or just a short animation. Whatever you need, you can find it on Fiverr. What I love the most is how easy Fiverr makes it to connect with talented freelancers from around the world, all at prices that will fit whatever your budget is. Plus, with Fiverr's secure payment system, you can trust that your transactions are safe and secure. No dodgy people you meet on Facebook groups that disappear with your money and never give you what you want. What? That's only happened to me? As an affiliate partner, I will get a small commission if you use the link and at no extra cost to you. As an affiliate partner, I will get a small commission if you click my link and you buy something, all at no extra cost to you. And best of all, you will be directly supporting the making of this podcast that you're listening to for free, but it is not free to make. So why wait? Head over to somewhere that you've probably never been before. It's called the show notes. So whatever app you're listening in, if it's Spotify or Apple Podcasts or anything at all, head to the show notes, click on my special link, and then you can browse thousands of gigs ready to help you with your next project. Well, I think I mentioned how I broke the rules of the name. So the original name was 7 Million Bikes, a Saigon podcast. So that's 6 words. It's too big. Really, it should really be only 3 words at most and really describe what the podcast is about. One of the things I learned as well, even still to this day, the business is called 7 Million Bikes, which is super confusing. And people ask all the time, even like this week and every week, what does it mean? So if somebody has to ask, what does it mean? Like it means if they come across that on Apple Podcast or Spotify and they see 7 million bikes, they have no idea what the podcast is about. So that's partly why I dropped that and changed it to a Vietnam podcast. You technically shouldn't use the word podcast in the title of your podcast because people already know that they're looking for podcasts. So they don't need to be reminded that it's a podcast.
How about show?
I think that would fall in the same category. I don't think you need it. I mean, but again, like the Tim Ferriss show, right? And that's one of the biggest podcasts. But so I still think, I can't think of a way to make that any better. I think a Vietnam podcast works because as well, it was one of the first podcasts as well. So it's really super obvious. Like this is a podcast about Vietnam. Yeah. There's another one called What About Vietnam? You Don't Know Vietnam. So these are all great names as well. But the biggest thing is try and keep it to 3 words, keep it short and simple, describe exactly what the podcast does. The other big rule is just be consistent. Like everybody tells you this all the time.
What is consistent? All the time. Twice a week, once a week, every 2 weeks?
Whatever you decide it is. So whether it's once a week, once a day, once a month, it's the same time, the same day. And then consistency with your content as well. So there's a podcast I don't want to name, but it's based here in Vietnam, and it's actually really good, but I don't follow it because they change what they do all the time. So you never really know, is it going to be like a panel of 4 people? Is it going to be an investigative episode? Like it's not consistent at all in their content. Like it changes all the time. So I never really know what it's going to be about. And also they're really inconsistent on publishing as well. And it does show, if you say I'm going to publish every single Monday at the same time, people know that the episode's going to be there because it's completely different to old school television. You probably only know the Netflix era, but old school TV was when a TV show would be on at 7:30 every night and you knew that you were going to sit down and tune it at 7:30 every night. Well, podcasting is not like that. Obviously, you publish it and then people listen when they want to. But if someone knows every Tuesday morning, I'm going to listen to this podcast on my drive to work, and then one Tuesday morning they go to look for it and it's not there, they're going to listen to something else and they might never come back to your podcast again because now they've found a new podcast to listen to. So you do have to be consistent, same time, same day, same week, same month, whatever you do, and be consistent in your content so people know exactly what they're going to be listening to.
Hi, if you listen to this far, thank you so much for listening. And if you enjoyed the show, please leave me a review on either Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or my YouTube channel. If you have any feedback for the show, please let me know on the Aspiring CMO podcast social media pages on Facebook and Instagram, or send me an email on my website. Now, let's get back to the episode. Okay, and my biggest question is, do you think every company should start a podcast? I see that more and more brands are coming up with their podcast, but is it smart to do it really?
Absolutely, yeah. I think it would be, right now you'd be silly not to have a podcast as a business. It's just one of the best ways to market, especially, I mean, social media is so challenging. Right? So where do people spend money on advertising, right? Like you want to advertise your business, you're going to spend money on social media. I don't know, TV ads, do they still exist? Billboards, newspaper ads,
Or
magazine
Facebook
ads, like
ads, yeah, like
yeah,
those
right.
are
So
popular.
you're going to spend your money on something, and you want to get the best bang for your buck, right? But like we know when you're scrolling, people are going scrolling quickly. You might have someone look at your ad for a split second, then go buy it. Okay, you're going to get, maybe with the targeting, you're going to get to the right people, but even that's more difficult now since Apple like turned off that feature
Yeah.
basically that makes it more difficult for Facebook to target you. Newspaper ad, I mean, I don't know who reads a newspaper these days, but obviously they do still exist. So there's just so many different ways of advertising. But a podcast, when you use it in the right way to tell a story and put the list and give the listener value, it means that you can really create deeper engagement with the listener. Because about the stats, the last stat I read is that when somebody starts a podcast, 80% of people will listen to the end. So you think about where people, again, are listening to podcasts, they've got it right in their ears. They're either driving, they're in the gym, they're doing the dishes, the housework, something where they're giving 100% attention to it. Like I can't listen to a podcast when I'm doing anything else. Like when I listen to a podcast, it's when I have zero distractions and I'm going to listen to basically every single word that is said, and you're going to take something from it. You're going to choose a podcast that you're like, oh, this one teaches me this, or it gives me value, or it entertains me. You're going to choose it for one of those reasons. And so as a business, for you to be able to create that piece of content where one, the person who listens to it is going to be your target audience. They wouldn't listen to it otherwise. Like, so you're already getting engagement with somebody that you want to be in front of. And then the 80% of people who start it are going to finish it. So you're getting their attention, which, as you know, like getting people's attention these days is so difficult because there's so many channels. There's so much content. It blows my mind. There's like Netflix, bloody Amazon Prime, BBC. It's endless, right? And then we have all these podcasts and you got YouTube videos. So for you to create something that's going to get somebody's attention like that is just so invaluable. It's relatively cheap compared to most other types of advertising as well. You can repurpose the content into so many ways, so you can have so many touch points. Because I think it was your podcast I saw recently that, what was it the person said, you need to touch somebody 7 times before they buy?
Yeah. That was she's a social media marketing agency owner. So she really advises her clients to keep pushing content, because a lot of businesses like, yo, this content marketing takes a lot of time, a lot of effort. I don't know what's the direct return. Why the hell should I do this? So then they put on like 5 posts, doesn't convert, never do it again. But then, in order to keep the attention, the momentum, you keep pushing and pushing. And honestly, like with my podcast too, like I understand like my stats are super new because it's a new podcast, but people around me are aware that I am the host of this podcast. So I'm still in that stage where like, okay, Annie has a podcast, but then I know I need to keep convincing them and keep promoting until they're like, okay, I'll listen to one of them. And it's like, I don't know, this is the risk, or I don't know, pain that every content marketer has to go through. It's just that I'm just gonna push until you give in.
Well, the thing is as well, right? So does it matter if they listen to your podcast? If somebody knows that you're the host of the Aspiring CMO, so it's all about brand leadership and like thought leadership. So just even by having a podcast, you're putting yourself out there as somebody who knows what they're talking about. And if I don't know what you exactly want to do with your personal brand or what you want to promote, but that puts you in a position of authority and leadership immediately. And so I think about like the shorts, like how many things do I see where I just see the short? There's one touch point. Maybe they see like the thing is, so the difference with YouTube, on YouTube, if you put a video out, you'll be lucky. You'll be doing amazing if you get 40% engagement, right? So if someone consumes 40% of that video. I've just started on YouTube a little bit. It's not my main focus, but like my podcast, when I put them on YouTube, get like 4% engagement. Like people listen to the beginning. And that's, I need to get better at it. Obviously, you can improve that. It's not something I'm not focused on at all right now. But still, it's 4% engagement. Whereas when I put out a podcast, if you get even 10, 20 people listening to that, 80% of them, so let's say 20 people listen, 16 of them are going to listen to the end on average. That's 16 people consuming everything you're saying. And you don't need hundreds or thousands of people. You just need the right people to listen to you. And then they go, oh, I want to work with Annie because I agreed with what she said. So it's all about brand positioning and just giving value. So like one of my clients, my biggest success stories, who I'm actually recording a podcast with them again this week. So they're doing the 3rd season now. They identified that they wanted to create a touch point to talk to their customers. So they had an email client base of like 500 customers that they'd worked with over the years. And they admittedly had just done a terrible job of communicating with them. And they'd never really talked to them much or reached out to them. And they wanted to make sure that when they were going to talk to them, they were going to give those clients value, not just like a email like, hey, we haven't heard from you. You haven't heard from us in a while. How are you? We'd love to work with you again, like something like that. They wanted to give value. So what I did with them, and it was all of their creation, but I did all the technical stuff and hosted actually as well, was created a podcast for them based on their industry that helped answer a question that people in their industry would ask and then solve it. So super simple. I mean, something that I wouldn't know about. It's pretty funny being the host of something like that because they script it and I have to ask the questions like I know what I'm talking about and I have no idea what I'm talking about. You're like, oh, so talking about blah, blah, blah. But it's obviously scripted, and don't tell anybody that sometimes things are scripted. That's a secret.
Right. Like this conversation is totally not scripted as well.
Totally not scripted, no. But so they sent that out to the database and like immediately got business from it. Like a high paying client immediately responded to them and were like, oh, hey, we love this. We haven't heard from you in ages. We actually forgot about you, which they knew that already. They knew that their customer base had forgotten about them because they hadn't been communicating well with them. And so it worked. Immediately they started getting business from it. And now we're doing the 3rd season with them as well. So having a podcast for your business is like a no-brainer. And some people think as well, like, oh, there's too many podcasts. There's not. There's not too many podcasts at all. There's maybe too many bad podcasts. There's maybe too many irrelevant podcasts. You now have these like podcast agencies, podcast production studios in like LA. One of them is called Wondery that just pump out podcast after podcast, sign up big celebrities.
Podcast? Like
what's what?
What is a bad podcast in your opinion?
Well, number one is bad audio. Like if you don't respect your listener, that you want to give them the best possible audio, then that's a really bad podcast. But some people do that and that's fine. Like, you know, I've been told that I can be too militant, I guess, like, because I want every podcast to be the best it can be. I want it to be amazing. And I love the medium. And so when somebody does just make a podcast with terrible audio, that frustrates me because I want it to sound good. So, and it kind of is like, yeah, maybe the beginning of podcasting, that was okay to do that, you know, just record on your phone and you just want to get something out there. But now equipment is cheaper, easier. It doesn't take much to make good quality audio. And then again, bad podcasting, like I mentioned before, I think being inconsistent when you publish, inconsistent in your content makes it really difficult. One of my biggest pet peeves is banter, like laughing and banter.
What is banter?
Like when two people just banter with each other, like just talk nonsense, like chit chat, and they like joke and laugh with each other. Okay. So again, many other people might be like, no, I love that type of podcast, but I personally can't stand it. If I turn on a podcast and it's like the two hosts and they're just like, hey, what did you do yesterday? Oh man, I went down here and blah, blah, blah. And they just like have banter, chit chat. Because again, with a podcast, for me, you want to give value. Whether it's entertainment is okay, but I don't find that entertaining. Just two people telling you about what they did last week or something like that. So a bad podcast for me would be that. A good podcast would be a good introduction, strong introduction, tells you what the podcast is going to be about, and then get into it and then give you the value that you want to learn from. So number one bad podcast, though, is a bad audio.
All right. And any common mistakes that you see businesses make when they start their podcast?
Stopping them.
Like maybe they choose the angle or something. Because I'm thinking like in your case study where you mentioned that the company started to answer frequently asked questions, like that's a great angle. But I don't know what unique angle can other businesses do. Maybe they mess it up.
Well, the two things. One, the worst thing that you can do is stopping the podcast. So once you start it, you should be consistent with it. Again, keep it going and keep giving that value. So There's a business I'm just pitched yesterday that I want to try and work with, and I looked them up, and they actually had started a podcast. I was like, oh wow, they have a podcast already. Then it had 2 episodes, and then that was it, and it stopped like 2 years ago or something like that. So that's an example of what not to do. So somebody at some point obviously had the idea, let's do a podcast for the business, and then it just disappeared. Pod faded, right? They only managed to get 2 episodes in. So that would be the number one thing of what not to do. Yeah. And I had another idea and I just forgot. What was it? I had something else I was going to add. What was the question again? Sorry, you're going to have to cut this bit out.
Just mistakes that companies usually make.
Fuck, what was it? I had 2. One was stopping.
Okay. I do have a new question though. In my theory, now that I'm a new podcaster, I believe that making a good promoting a podcast is just as important as making a good podcast. Do you agree with this, or do you think it's nonsense?
No, 100%. That's the most difficult part, is promoting it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But like anything, you could make, you can make any product. You can make the best product in the world. Doesn't matter what it is. If you don't promote it and market it, nobody will know about it. People hate that companies spend money on marketing, whether it's an English language school, and they're like, oh, they spend 40% on marketing. How do you think they get new students? If it's a charity and they spend X amount of money on marketing or fundraising, and people get so angry about it, and you're like, how do you think they get more money to do more good? It doesn't matter what industry, what business it is, marketing is always the most difficult thing to do. So, yeah.
Yeah, amazing. And now briefly, walk me through your course. Do you how do you see your students perform? Just walk me through the course, how to start a podcast.
Yeah, so it's basically trying to answer a lot of the questions that everybody asks. The more and more you're part of Facebook groups, you just see the same questions getting asked over and over again. What microphone do I use? What's the host platform? How do I create the name? All of these things. So there's not a huge amount on it that's groundbreaking, but it's taking everything I've learned and put it all into one place. So the course is designed for a podcast beginner, and it's to help them save time mostly, because, I remember when I first started, right away, it's something, as someone who's somewhat of a podcasting expert, something seems so obvious, and then you realize, oh, it's only obvious because you know it. So, for example, finding a podcast host seems to me like the most super simple, basic thing in the world. But then even with my clients, you have to walk them through what is a podcast host. And you see people, and I remember in the beginning I had a spreadsheet of all the different podcast hosts, comparing the pricing plans, what you got for them, before I ended up settling on Buzzsprout. And so the idea of the course is to save all of that time. So instead of you having to go and do all of that research, go and read all these blog posts, find it all out, I'm going to share that all with you in the one place. And you get to hear it from me, which apparently people like listening to me, which is still pretty weird.
That's not weird, but yeah, that's a great way to sell your course. Well, I'm making it. People like listening to me.
It is something that, awesome. Been through with people is, what is your USP, your unique selling point? And I still struggle to figure out what that is exactly, because there's so many people that do similar things to what I do. And let's be honest, there's not that many different ways to do podcasting. So what makes my course different, or what makes working with me different? And I hate to say this, and I absolutely hate it, but I think it's me. Like, I'm the unique selling point, because people...
I don't think you hate to say it. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, it's a personal brand, right? It's Neil Mackay, the podcast guy, and you've done so many podcasts. And you were still, did you say you were running like 20 podcasts
about 20 clients in total, on and off.
That's nuts. That's yeah, I could maybe start a course, but obviously it would be nowhere as good as yours, right? I have experience with this 10 episodes I put out so far, which is like nothing. So definitely your experience has been a lot.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, it's been difficult, the whole personal branding. Now if you go to my website, my face and picture are all over it, and selling myself, which for the longest time I did not want to do that, but then I kind of realized you almost have to these days. And if you want to build something, people want to know who they're working with, they want to know the person behind the brand and the story. And so I put all of that front and center. So that's another big thing that's changed over the last 6 months to a year. Before then, I was trying to hide behind the brand. And it was a bit, I didn't really want to do it. I know people might listen or see and be like, yeah, you're full of shit. You are happy to put yourself front and center. I really wasn't. It really took a big, big effort and a big conscious decision to be like, yeah, okay, I should put myself front and center. So even the name, Neil Mackay, the podcast guy, man, I cringe at it every time I say it and every time I read it. Honestly, I cringe. But mostly the reason was because my name is difficult to pronounce, because with my last name, there's about 5 different ways you can say it. Mackay, McKay, I don't even know. Nobody ever says it Mackay. So the biggest reason was just the rhyming, so that if you even read it, you would hopefully understand that Mackay is said the way that it rhymes with Guy. So Neil Mackay, the podcast guy, kind of rolls off the tongue a bit. And since I started using it, yeah, the feedback has been from so many people like, oh, I love that. That's so cool. So it shows that I'm doing the right thing, I guess. So just to go back to your question, with my course, when I kind of joke, like, you get to learn from me, but that is part of the unique selling point. And it has been the feedback from students and from the clients I work with, is that they do really enjoy working with me. So that's it's kind of nice, but it's not like I focus so much on the technical stuff. That's not like my main focus, but it's kind of seems to have come to the front.
I like this course idea too, because you're right. Like, a lot of people, when they start a podcast, they just go onto this like millions of blog posts and then trying to make sense of it. And from an SEO perspective, I don't trust any blog post at this point in time. But I think it's a great idea too.
Thank you.
Yeah. Awesome. And last question I always ask is, like, if you were to start again, what advice would you give to people in their early 20s who want to start their own thing in marketing?
In marketing?
Yeah. Or just really any project.
Yeah, like I said, I don't consider myself a marketer, but you do have to learn a lot of marketing skills. So I really don't know what advice I would give to somebody who wants to start in marketing. I have no idea.
Okay, start your own project, because, for you, 7 million bikes was the first one. And yeah, anything that advice would you give for younger?
Quality. Just focus on quality, doing the best you can with what you can. So I'm very much a doer, and I'm a perfectionist in a way, but I will do what I can with the money I have and the time that I have. So if I only have money to buy a Blue Yeti microphone, which is not the best one, but I want to get started now, I'm going to get started now. If I have to have this done by a certain time, then I'm not going to nitpick every single tiny little thing that's going to take it too long. So my advice, I give this in the course a lot, and I give it to lots of people, is such a cliche, like from Nike, but like, just do it, like, just get started. Like, it's a big thing for me. So I studied sports science, and one of the things we learned about is something called paralysis by analysis. So with elite level athletes, they analyze every aspect of their performance. It's insane, actually. Like some of the things we studied, like, for example, somebody who's a swimmer, they're going to analyze, like, to the minute detail, how they dive into the swimming pool to make sure the dive is as good as it can be. So they'll go back and look at footage with a sports scientist and make sure that their foot was in the right position, the toes are in the right position, that then's going to give the best entry into the water, which is going to knock off, like, a gold medal can be the difference of like 0.01 seconds or something like that. So it's all about that. But then there's like a bell curve. So if you analyze too much and you overanalyze, you're going to paralyze yourself because you're thinking about it too much. So it's called paralysis by analysis. Yeah. And that happens to many, many people. I know people that happens to, where they will analyze something so much to the point where they'll be like, I'm just not going to do it. It's too much. So that can happen with podcasting. That's so overwhelming. There's so much to think about with the equipment and the hosting platform and the publishing and everything. And so you could look at all of that and just be like, wow, this is too crazy. I'm just not going to do it. So my biggest advice, whatever you're doing, don't overanalyze things. Just do it. Do what you can. Learn as you go. Make mistakes. I think too many people as well want to be perfect the first time. And you're never going to be perfect the first time. And you're not even going to be perfect the 100th time. But as long as you... And I saw one of your posts about that, just being better every episode. So just focus on that. Just get started, get it done, and be better. Because I think anyone who's successful was never perfect the first time they started, whatever they started.
Yeah, Yeah, 100%. Thank you so much for joining the podcast. And if somebody would like to reach out to you, how can they find you?
Yeah, go to my website, just 7millionbikes.com, or of course, Facebook, 7 Million Bikes Podcasts, and you can find me there.
Amazing. Thank you, Neil, for joining the show. And I hope
you are welcome. Thank you for having me. It's been awesome.
Hi, my name is Sal Jeffries. I run the Mindset, Mood and Movement podcasts. I've been working with Neil at 7 Million Bikes for the whole of this year, literally from the start of my podcast to date. And I want to say a couple of things. So when we record the podcast, sometimes there are things that I need tweaking. There could be edits or clips. It's really simple. I give those instructions to Neil, he gets it sorted. There's sometimes a sound level differences between the guest mic and mine. Again, that's all sorted so the outcome is a really balanced sound. And also if there are issues with voice, little kind of sound interruptions, all those things that can distract a listener, Neil knows exactly what to do, cleans it up. The end result, a highly professional, beautiful sounding podcast without distraction. That's exactly what I want. I know my listeners do. So if you're interested in having that level of podcast and that kind of quality, Neil is a great guy and I highly recommend you speak to him.